So today we're going to be talking about 7 of the weirdest writing tips that I have, but that have actually made a huge difference in how I write and my productivity and all that sort of thing. So let's get right into it. Sup peoples, and welcome back to another video. It has been so long since I filmed, my tripod actually collected dust. But that's why we're going to ease into it with a nice, chill video where I tell you all the weird things I do when I write. And I clean my room, because that's just a mainstay on this channel. I tell you things while I clean my room because it is apparently perpetually never clean enough. First up, we're going to start with laundry and a mystery tracker. Now, a mystery tracker is one of the main things that has helped me in my writing. It is sort of like a side, I'm supposed to be folding while I do this. It is like a side folder document. And basically, whenever I run into something in my writing that would have like some sort of loose end, say a hint as to something in the backstory, or a plot twist that will come later, like foreshadowing for a plot twist that will come later, a question like, how did the villains know that the heroes were there? I will write it down in my mystery tracker. And what this means is that all of these loose ends are conveniently stored in one place so that I don't forget about them. Because think about it, you have a gigantic novel or comic or whatever it is. It's going to be hundreds of pages. Are you really going to remember the foreshadowing that you included on page 5 when it comes to fruition on page 500? No. You're just not, unless you have like a way better working brain than I do. I'm the kind of person who names a teacher in one scene and then forgets their name in the next scene, and so we have 3 math teachers all with varying different versions of being named Mr. Smith. It just doesn't really work. So the mystery tracker is sort of how I curb that chaos that I usually create. By having this side document, I know exactly what everybody's name is, I know exactly what I need to refer back to or include closure for, and this way when the story wraps up I can go through and make sure that I've ticked all my boxes and don't have any random loose ends for readers to be confused by, and that there's not going to be any mystery that was exciting or intriguing to them that never gets a resolution. Another bonus document that I have is my trash drafts document. It's where I store all of my trash drafts. It's got a fairly self-explanatory title. A lot of times, writing isn't necessarily bad, it's just not right for that scene. And so I'll save that. Let's say I'm writing my comic. I have a lot of trash drafts for my comic and my novel. So let's say I'm writing my comic Project Punk. I write a scene in which the protagonists resolve this argument they're having. This isn't a scene, it's probably is a scene, they argue quite a lot. And let's say that I put this, I don't know, 1 issue after the argument happens. Later, I'm reading through and I decide that the resolution happened too quickly, like they should have stewed in that bad vibe for a little bit longer, because I'm that kind of a person, you know, I like to let characters stew in their bad vibes. So I decide that I need to move this scene. I don't know where yet. It's not a bad scene. It's just not right for where the story is right now. So instead of deleting it and having to rewrite the whole thing again later, I just put it in my trash drafts document and I label what it is. I'll write like conflict resolution scene from whatever page or chapter or issue. It gets confusing when you write a bunch of different mediums. And then I'll have that for later when I want to use that scene, or maybe not even that exact scene, just a version of it. Or another example is right now in my novel, Project Eros. I will link the vlogs about that up above on whichever side that appears. I wrote draft 1, which the pacing was off. Then I wrote draft 2, which the pacing was off for a different reason. And now I'm on draft 3, and I'm actually nearing the end of draft 3. I'm in like the last third of that draft, and that's going to be the final draft where everything's on the page. Not like the final draft, but after this I just have to pretty much edit it, I think. That's exciting. I'm excited to show you some more of that. I have to film vlogs for that. The trash drafts document has come in super, super handy. When I was writing draft 1 and 2, I kept writing scenes and then being like, no, that doesn't fit here, or no, that happened too quickly. But I didn't want to delete any of it because it wasn't bad writing, it just didn't fit the moment or the character. So I would just take it and I'd put it in this trash drafts document. And almost all of that has actually gotten used in draft 3. I'm basically just moving scenes around. So like, instead of trashing failed draft 1, I'll go through it and I'll reuse all those scenes that work, but just were in the wrong places before in draft 3. And in this way, 1, I get to save writing instead of just throwing it away, because you took effort, I took effort, we both took time to write those words. They should be used for something, even if it's just, or even if they don't get used. It's just good to have them so you don't end up having to rewrite a scene if you end up needing one that's similar to one you already had. It's also made it a lot easier because sometimes you need like a jumping off point. Like for example, there's this one scene where initially 2 characters, how do I explain this? So one of the plot points is this character, Aaron, getting in an argument with another character, Parker, okay? If you want to beta read my comic, there is a link in the description of this video. Or not my comic, my novel. Sorry, I have so many projects going on right now, I'm getting them confused. If you want to beta read this novel, you can check it out in the link in the description. That scene is actually already up, I believe. So they get into an argument. Initially, I had written a scene where it resolved itself pretty quickly. But like I said, I now like characters to sort of stew in those bad vibes a little bit longer. I think it makes it feel more real, because if your characters are just like, oh, I'm bickering, and then they're like, I'm sorry too, and then they're friends again. That's not really how people act, you know? They're like, they don't want to talk about their feelings. They don't want to admit that they were wrong, that sort of thing. So these 2 characters initially got into an argument and then resolved it almost immediately. But in my new version, I did not want it to happen like that because it felt unrealistic. So I took that scene where they got into the argument and resolved it, and I split it. So I was like, okay, I'm going to use this beginning with the argument, and I'm going to use the resolution all the way over here in a different scene. And that just meant that I could use the same dialogue from the resolution, but put it into a different setting, and I could take the argument and have that. And it just made my job easier. And that's sort of like, it's not cheating to try and make your job easier. You're still writing those words. They might as well get used. I talked about that point for a long time, so we'll move on. All right, so this is now one of the weirder ones to admit on camera. I've talked about it a bit, so I shouldn't be that weirded out. Basically, role-playing. I play Dungeons and Dragons. I have for years now. I love role-playing. It's super fun. I initially saw it as totally divorced from writing. Now I realize they're the same thing, basically. One is just I'm acting it out in the moment, and the other one, instead of acting it out in that moment, I'm writing it on a page. So I think role-playing and writing can actually really help each other out. For example, there's this argument scene. All I'm talking about in this video is arguments. I'm sorry. There's this argument scene in my comic, Project Punk, in which 2 characters get into a very heated, yelly discussion. You know, it's a full-on fight. They're yelling at each other. And I was sitting at my desk, and it was sort of hard to write that sitting at my desk, listening to chill music, vibing. You know, like, it just didn't fit the atmosphere I was going for with this scene. So what I did was I walked over to this very mirror, and I grabbed a notebook, and I yelled at myself in it. Like, I didn't actually say it out loud because I live in a small house and people would have heard, and that would make me feel very awkward. But I was just like, I don't know, it looked weird, right? It feels very embarrassing to do on camera. But basically, I took the 2 characters, and I'd stand here for one of them, like facing out of the mirror, and for the other character, I'd face into the mirror, and I had this back and forth conversation with myself in which they fought. And because I wasn't sitting there trying to think of the right things to say, I was just sort of role-playing and reacting in that moment, it actually came off a lot more like an argument, I think, because it wasn't staged. I wasn't trying to make it sound like I was having an argument. I was having an argument. And then I would just, if I liked a line, I'd go and I'd write it down. And that scene is still in my comic. Sure, I have to edit it still, but as of right now, that scene, word for word, what I said to myself in my reflection, is in my comic, which is cool. I just found that incredibly helpful for figuring out how to have this argument feel spur of the moment. I wanted their words to feel spur of the moment, and that really helped me because it was spur of the moment. The same way that when I'm role-playing, I don't have time to think of something to say. I just have to say it, which sort of makes the characters, if you can get into their head, come across more naturally because you're just reacting, even if it is to a made-up scenario. Now, do I think You may have just heard a sneeze, that was my dog. Now, do I think that you need to role play every single interaction your characters have? Totally not. I don't do it most of the time. But if I'm stuck on a scene, it can really help me. So that's why I wanted to mention it. Especially with dialogue. Especially with dialogue. And in that same vein of role play, I wanted to talk about something else I do for role playing. I haven't done this for one of my novel or comic characters yet, but I plan to in the future. And this is something that I use specifically for role play and my role play characters, and it's really helped me get into their mindset and flesh out their backstories and personalities and all of that. And that is journaling. So basically, I will, for each of my D&D characters, I've played 2 D&D characters, 1 Star Wars character. I didn't do it for the Star Wars character, but I did a version of it for her, which I'll explain, I guess. So I think that journaling is a really good way to get into your character's mindset. Like, let's just take my current D&D game, okay? Every session, I take notes throughout the session of what's happening, but also how my character feels. And then if I have time after the session, I will sit down and I will turn that session into a journal entry. And I'll just dive into how she felt about things. Or she'll include anecdotes about her past based on what happened and how things reminded her of other events that had happened in her life and things like that. It's been really helpful for figuring out how my character thinks, how my character talks. When I first came up with her, she was sort of solemn. But in writing her journal, she had sort of like a snarky inner monologue. It's like she's very sad, but she's sort of like snarky and bitter about that sadness, if that makes sense. And I didn't realize that until I started playing her and until I started working on her journal. And now I play her totally differently than I'd initially thought of her. And through this, journaling can be really helpful exercise to get into your character's mindset, which I just think is cool. Oh, and the character that I journaled but didn't really journal, she was a Mandalorian. So instead of writing out what happened in a journal, she would paint her armor different colors or customize it or add symbols depending on how things had gone. So like different colors mean different things according to legends, and there are different symbols that mean different things. So her armor was sort of like a living, walking journal. Next rule, call it the don't over edit rule. Sometimes you really shouldn't edit. And there's this fine line. So when should you not edit? I think you should not edit when removing a scene doesn't help your story. What do I mean by this? There are certain scenes in my comic or in my novel that I love. I love them. Are they 100% necessary? No. Would the story still work without them? I could make it work. Am I really invested in these scenes because I love them so much? And if somebody hated them, would that be crushing to me? Definitely. And because of that last bit, I'm so tempted to remove them. For example, in my comic, I am one of those people who loves flashbacks. I love them to death. I know that not everybody does, but I personally love them. There's one issue in my comic that's just flashbacks. That's what it is. And that's sort of like scary, you know? On the one hand, I know that I love this thing about my comic, and I loved writing it, and I do think that it's fun and interesting to read, and I think it explains things about the character's backstory, and I had a reason for there to be flashbacks there. I think it works with the story. I don't think that removing it would strengthen the comic, but I think that there will probably be people who will read it and be like, that was a tangent we didn't need, and that makes me nervous, because I love that scene. I love that whole issue. It's one of my favorite things I've written for my comic. But knowing that, and knowing that people might not like it, is scary. So it makes me want to remove it. So don't remove something. Like, over editing is when you remove something because you think other people won't like it, even though you like it. I personally don't think that you should remove something from your story if you think it is an important part of your story. It's the same way that if I gave my romance novel to an editor and they were like, oh yeah, this is good, just change this key plot point. I don't think I'd be able to do that. You know, if they give me a critique and they're like, I think that you could make this stronger by doing that, I'd be like, thank you, that's super appreciated. But if they were like, I think that you should change the whole core of your story, I'd be like, then it's not really my story anymore. You know, like at the end of the day, even if it's scary, I want to put my story out into the world, not the version that I think would be most popular. And also, the scenes that you might be tempted to remove because they're, I don't know, not to everyone's liking, they're probably the scenes that you feel most strongly about. That flashback issue, I love. And so because I love it, I put a bunch of effort and time and thought into it. It's probably going to be one of the stronger scenes. It's probably going to be one of the ones where my writer voice shines through the most. So by removing it, I'm sort of removing me from my book, which is not what we want to do. This is actually a bonus tip, wildcards, flashback issue that I just mentioned. It is actually what I call my wildcard issue. If you're not a comic book writer, let me explain this. This is a monthly comic. One issue is 20 to 22 pages and it comes out every month. Every 6 months, so every 6 issues, they are compiled into a trade paperback, one of these. It's a collection of 6 issues. Each set of 6 issues, because they'll be compiled into one of these, has sort of like a mini arc within the story, if that makes sense. Using comics as my medium gave me a lot of leeway to have mini self-contained stories within my bigger story. So I let myself have a wild card issue. Every 6 issues, so every trade paperback like I showed you, I give myself one issue to just have fun. Of course it's related to the story, of course it's supposed to further the story, but it can do that in maybe a more fun or creative way. Like in the first set of 6 issues, I gave myself my flashback issue. In my second set of 6 issues, don't quote me on this because I'm still actually editing those, it may change, but currently I gave myself a sort of artsy opening. I wanted it to be like 5 pages that were totally silent. And in the third arc, which I've begun brainstorming but haven't finished yet, there's going to be this side character who's going to become important, and we sort of get like a deep dive on his life because it was fascinating to me and I wanted to write that. These are my wild cards. They're the things that when I get to that issue, I'm so excited to write it. You know, like usually I'm excited to write, but when I get to a wild card issue, I'm so excited because I can do whatever I want. It's sort of like giving myself permission to just test my creativity. Next, I want to talk about the overnight rule, which is a editing related rule again. I grouped these up a little bit. Can you tell that I organized them? So the way that the overnight rule works is I noticed that I used to write a comic book issue and then jump right into editing it. But if I jumped right into editing it, I noticed that like it was still so fresh in my mind from having just written it that it sort of all muddled together and it was harder to edit. So I started implementing my overnight rule. I would write and then I would take a night off and I would edit the next day. And this gap between writing and editing made it so that I was going back to what I'd written the day before with fresher eyes. And I was able to see its flaws more plainly because I wasn't like as in the moment, as in the story, as when I had just written it. And you can implement this to varying degrees. Maybe you take an hour off, maybe you take a night off. That's a fairly self-explanatory tip. Just try to separate editing and writing. Now, this is a tip that was not mine. This actually came from the back of one of the comic books that I so love. The comic book that made me want to be a comic book writer. And that is Saga. In the back of Saga Book 1, Brian K. Vaughan had a section talking about the process of writing a comic book. And I read that, and it taught me how to write a comic book, but it also taught me a lot of little bits of writing advice. And one of the things that stuck with me was that he said that dialogue didn't have to be realistic. And that he doesn't try to have his dialogue be realistic or even naturalistic. He just wants it to sound right. That's me paraphrasing. I tried to get it all in there, but it might be a little bit different in his official quote. I have that on my Instagram somewhere. Anyway, I loved that. I think that's such good advice. Should your dialogue sound sort of like a real person should say it? Probably. I don't think that realistic dialogue is bad advice. You don't want it to sound like all your characters are a computer or all your characters are the same person or anything like that. But I think that sometimes we forget that all of our favorite shows don't sound like things real people would say if you really break it down. Real people have a bunch of stops and starts. Like the amount of editing I'm gonna have to do on this video because of me losing my train of thought mid-sentence, you would never want to read a comic. You wouldn't even want to watch a video of somebody talking just like how a person talks. The amount of times I say like in a normal sentence, it's not even funny. I noticed it when I started doing YouTube and I hate it about myself, but I cannot change it. It's just like a part of me. What I try to do now is not have my characters sound realistic. I just try to have them sound like themselves. Instead of asking yourself, what is a realistic line that my character can say? Ask yourself, what is a realistic line for my character? Okay? Let's take my protagonist of my comic, Nikki. Do I want her to sound realistic or do I want her to sound realistic for Nikki? I think I want her to sound realistic for Nikki. So instead of trying to figure out if my dialogue is realistic enough, stressing out about whether or not it sounds like a real person would say it or if it sounds too sci-fi or too fantasy or whatever, I just try and write words and lines that my character, Nikki, would say. And so long as my character Nikki sounds like Nikki, I'm doing it right. Next up, this is another dialogue tip because I like to organize my tips, and that is that you should read your dialogue on its own. I discovered this because of writing comics. So basically, when you write a script for a comic book, you have a description of what the artist is going to draw, and then you have the dialogue. And the dialogue will obviously be shown up for the readers. But they're never going to see your descriptions. You know, they don't see the prose that I write, basically. That meant that when I was reading and editing my comic, I was reading it with these breaks of description in between. And so the reader wouldn't get that. They'd just get my dialogue. So I started reading it once altogether, the whole script, and then once just the dialogue to see how the conversation would flow and how the reader would experience it. And then when I started writing novels, I decided to apply that. Because even though, yes, the reader is going to see the prose in a novel, and I read it all together once, I then like to go through and just read the dialogue to see how the conversation would flow. Our characters don't have the prose in between what's happening. You know, they're just saying their lines and doing their stuff. So to see how their conversation would flow, I would just read my dialogue. And that way I can sort of get like two different perspectives on how the story is going. I'm sorry if you can hear my dog barking in the background. Especially if you have like a big scene with a lot of dialogue, I would suggest reading it, just the dialogue, to see sort of how that conversation flows, because it's going to be like a longer, more important part of your story. The final two are about productivity, so I will go over them together. First up, repetition. I like routine and I like scheduling, and so writing routines are super vital to my writing productivity. And I will link my video on whichever side goes on about how to make your own unique writing routine. But another thing is repetition. So right now my routine is that every night at like 6 p.m. I have finished my work and I have an hour until dinner at 7. This is the one time during the day that I do not have any other tasks looming over me. So I sit down from like 6 to 7 and I write. And this is also the time that my dad plays music. He plays music while he makes dinner. So I'm sitting in the living room listening to one of my dad's playlists while he makes dinner and I am writing. And I started doing that just because it was the only convenient time in the day for me to write. But now it's like the moment that I hear the music click on, my brain just goes, writing time. And so it's a lot easier for me to fall into the routine of writing. And you can do this with all different things. You can always write at the same time, or you can light the same scented candle when you write, or you can listen to the same playlist when you write, or you can go to the same place when you write, different things like that. And this repetition sort of will help train your mind that when this thing happens, click, time for writing, and will help you focus better or drop into it quicker. Because at least for me, I sort of struggle in the beginning to drop into whatever flow state of writing, and then once I'm there, I can just tap away at that computer forever. But getting to that place is a lot harder than writing actually is. It's like getting to be able to write is harder than writing a lot of times for me. So once you're in that flow state, we get on to number 2. I think that burnout is obviously something to be avoided. Before, I avoided burnout by only writing on the weekends. I would not write all week, and then I would save up all my writing and I'd write for like a couple hours on the weekend. And that worked well when I was writing comics, because you can write comics much quicker than you can a novel, because you're mostly just writing, like I said, a description and dialogue. I could knock out like 20 pages of a comic in a couple hours. It was great. That was a whole issue. I could do like an issue or two in a day. I could totally write only twice a week. Now that I'm writing novels, it doesn't really work that way. Do I still write on weekends? Yes, but I also write on weekdays. I write every single day that I can. Once in a while, there will be something that comes up and I'm like, I can't write, or I'll hit writer's block and I will take a break and step away. When I can, I try to write every single day. I'm actually, it's 5:20 right now, so I need to go wrap up my work and get to writing. So I'm gonna try and do this quickly. Once I started writing every day, I discovered that 1, my productivity was better and I started making a lot more progress on my novel, but 2, I burned out a lot faster. I am behind on my novel progress right now because at the beginning of this year, I was just really burned out after writing for NaNoWriMo. Like, I wrote every single day. I almost hit the 50,000 word mark on NaNoWriMo. And that was the first time I tried to write a novel since I was like 16. And it was the first time I'd ever written every day for a whole month. And it was really cool. I made a lot of progress. I wrote almost 50,000 words. But in December and January and even February, I just did not want to keep working on that book. I had not planned it properly. I had sort of rushed in. I was just feeling like burnt out and discouraged. It felt like it would never get done. I was like, I wrote almost half this book, but it's not even good enough. And that was draft 1, and then we we went into draft 2 in late February, and then we ended up doing draft 3, and just all of this discouraging, having to rework things, having to redo things I'd already done, feeling like I wasn't making progress. When I feel like my writing is bad, I instantly get into a writing rut, and sometimes there's just nothing that I can do to convince myself that it's good, even if it's the same thing I'd written and decided was good like 2 days ago. If I'm just feeling insecure, it's just that's over for me, you know, instant writer's block. I used to try and write through that, and it would burn me out. And so the writing every day thing, it's cool, the productivity's good, but it's sort of a double-edged sword, because I found that I would be writing more, but then I would take like a 3-month break. So all the headway that I had made, it was something like I had written only twice a week again, instead of writing every day for a whole month. And I discovered that part of that was because I hate starting. You know, I hate starting writing. It's the hardest part for me. So what I started to do is every night when I sit down to write, I will write for a little while, and then when I feel like I sort of want to keep writing, but I'd be fine with stopping, that's when I stop. I don't go until I don't want to write anymore. I stop when I still sort of want to write. Because that way, in the back of my head, I'm still thinking about that scene I was in the middle of, or the thing I want to work on, or whatever it is. And I'm just like, the gears are turning, and the story is still on my mind. So the next day, when I sit down to write again, I've thought about it, and I, like, subconsciously, and I know what I want to happen in that scene, and I'm excited to work on it. Versus before, when I would write as much as I possibly could in a day, and then the next day I'd sit down and be like, I don't feel like writing. I wrote all my writing yesterday. I'll just skip it today. And that would turn into skipping it the next day, and the next day, and the next day, until eventually, oh wow, I haven't written in 3 months. So stop while you still sort of want to write. Now, obviously this is subjective. Some people might have more discipline than I do. Some people might have a different method than I do. All of these tips are things that work for me. They may not work for you, but if you're struggling with similar things that I am, they may be the answer you were looking for. Thank you so much for sitting through this video. I thought it would take me like 15 minutes to film. It's been almost an hour. I need to go to work, and I will see you in the next video next week, where I think it's going to be a Project Eros vlog. So if you want to see one of these projects I've been talking so much about, feel free to subscribe. If you have yet to subscribe, you should subscribe so you see those videos. Till then, I will see you on the next page.